Hi there. I'm not Daniel Gross, though it's fitting maybe that we traded places in our talks because I did work for him 20 years ago when I first started learning something about EMU. And what I'm going to talk to you today about are some of the underlying causes of the crisis, the inadequate responses we've seen to it, and then the implications of these for these issues of accountability and transparency that we're talking about here. So that's what I'll do today. But just first, again, thanks to you, Jake, for having me out, to your colleagues here at USC, to Chris and others who organized. So let me start with a bit of a metaphor. I think lots of different causes and culprits in the outbreak of the crisis. We heard different speakers talking about different things from excessive public sector debt, private debt, lack of competitiveness, regulatory failure in banking. You can look at personalities. But I'm a scholar of EU politics and law and a scholar above all of institutions. So I want to think about it in a more institutional sense at the sort of underlying causes. And I think this quote from Draghi back in 2000 when he said this, that the incompleteness of the Euro design is Europe's Achilles heel. Now, the metaphor I want to use really to think about what went wrong with the Eurozone is that when it was designed, it was a half-built ship, right? And everyone involved knew that, right? I remember Daniel knew that. We talked about it back in the mid-90s. But they decided to go off to sea with their half-built ship. And it was half-built or incomplete in many key respects, okay? It was incomplete in terms of the limited fiscal integration, the small budget, no capacity for counter-cyclical redistribution, the flawed fiscal rules in Maastricht, which is what I'm going to be focusing on here, but also things like the absence of banking union, inadequate mechanisms for macroeconomic convergence. So there are all these things that are incomplete. And you might ask yourself, why weren't people more worried? Well, one of the speakers talked about this before, integration proceeds through crisis, right? You can look at the last quote, the famous one from Monnet from his memoirs where he said, Europe will be forged in crisis, it will be the sum of the solutions to those crises. And this certainly was true with respect to the euro. And look what Prodi says in 2001. They knew, they said there's going to be a crisis, right? And then that's when we'll fix it, right? Because we can't get the political agreement we need now, right? It's an intergovernmental decision. Some states aren't ready to do what needs to be done for the fully baked monetary union. So let's just go to sea on our half-built ship. Problem, of course, then is, the crisis hit, seas got rough, and you're in your half-built ship trying to fix it at sea in these rough conditions. And in fact, the incompleteness of the structure actually exacerbated the crisis in ways we can talk about. But then, so now, what am I going to talk about specifically? I want to look specifically at one aspect of the incompleteness of EMU, what I call flawed fiscal federalism, the misconceived response to that in terms of the Fiscal Compact Treaty, okay, and why it's stupid, basically is what I'll explain, and why it won't work. And then some big picture conclusions about what this kind of pattern of incomplete design and flawed responses means for the integration project and what it means for the accounting issues we're talking about here today. So quickly, flawed fiscal federalism. In the event of a state fiscal crisis in any kind of quasi-federal multi-level union like the EU or the US or many others, anytime you have a state fiscal crisis, there's of course going to be big pressure on the feds to bail out the struggling state. And this is basic stuff. You probably all heard of these ideas that if the feds then guarantee the solvency, come through with bailouts for the states, this creates moral hazard. So that's a problem. Okay? Now, therefore, any such system that has free movement of capital, monetary union, state-level fiscal authority must find some way to control state debt and to limit moral hazard. There's got to be a way to do it. Okay? And many, all these systems, whether it's Brazil, Argentina, Russia, they've confronted this problem. Okay? There are two ways to do it. Okay? You got two choices. One is tough love. Okay? And there you let states default to establish a credible commitment that you will not give bailouts. Now, here I disagree respectfully a little bit with what the President said yesterday in his terrific speech when he pointed to 1790 and Alexander Hamilton. Yes, and a lot of scholars point to that, looking at the EU, saying we need to do that, right, what Alexander Hamilton did. That was the Revolutionary War debt, right? But the more pertinent example is what happened in the early 1840s, when 9 states were on the verge of default, right, and they went to the federal government asking for a bailout, then it wasn't war debt, it was infrastructure spending debt, and the federal government told them, no, go to hell, basically. And it was, 8 states and Florida, which was still a territory, all defaulted, right? And after they defaulted, of course, it was a little easier for them to default because it was all owed to European creditors, okay? But after they defaulted, no one wanted to lend them money, of course, they're out of the markets, so they imposed on themselves balanced budget rules. That's why 49 out of 50 states have them, right? Except Vermont, which has sterling credit anyway. But they imposed those on themselves, and importantly, the feds didn't impose those rules on the states, right?
What year was this?
1841-2, okay? Well, and it took a few years before all of them had imposed that phenomenon spread. But anyway, so that's number one, is tough love approach. Number two approach is you can give bailouts, but then you do have to give conditions, okay? Because you can't just write blank checks. And this approach, right, you might say it shows more solidarity, but there's a problem with it, that if you do this approach, it requires far-reaching interference from the center in the fiscal decisions, in the EU's case, sovereign decisions of states. Right? And there's a problem for democracy, right? And that's, why people in Greece don't like the Troika, understandably, but you got a choice. Now, what about Europe? Well, in the original Maastricht regime, this is the question I was asking Mr. Asmussen, the rules of Maastricht when the Eurozone was created, because all the architects, Daniel Gross was here, he was one of them, he was involved, everyone, they knew this stuff. They were reading Barry Eichengreen and economic historians, and they knew the US example, they were drawing on this. They said, okay, we've got a plan, we'll have a no bailout clause, okay? That's Article 104B of Maastricht. We'll have the Stability and Growth Pact, that'll have rules about excessive deficits, et cetera, but then if you go wrong, right, you're on your own, okay? But this system was flawed and it's not enforced. Famously and ironically, it was Germany who, and then France also, who killed the Stability and Growth Pact, which are the rules, and the Commission tried to enforce it. They blocked it in the Council. They changed the rules by 2005. They killed it. And then in the added act of chutzpah in 2010, the German finance minister, Per Steinbrück, killed the no bailout clause when he said, and I quote, the treaties don't foresee any help for insolvent countries, but in reality, the other states would have to rescue those running into difficulty. Okay, so they killed it. All right, fast forward, I'm not going to tell all the ugly story. Oh, and okay, why did they do that, of course? Why did they not let them default? Why was this impossible? Well, okay, of course it was because banks from the core, France, Netherlands, Germany were heavily exposed to sovereign debt on the periphery. We know that. And so it would have been very problematic because there wasn't a banking union in place, right? And then if you think about it politically, while it was unpopular for Merkel and others to bail out countries on the periphery, it would have been even more unpopular for them to bail out their own banks, right? Because if you think about the politics of blame, if you bail out peripheral countries, the blame accrues to these bad governments on the periphery. If you bail out your own banks, the blame accrues to you for your mismanagement, et cetera. So, okay, so then that whole system scrapped, we go to system 2, where we say, okay, Maastricht's been thrown out, how are we going to deal with this now? So the new system is bailouts, conditions, and courts. Okay, and I got to hurry up. I'm going to talk faster now because I'm running low on time. So the new Eurozone governance regime is essentially, yes, there's going to be bailouts, okay? So there's first the Hellenic Fund, then the EFSM, EFSF, then the ESM, right? So these bailout funds, but they're going to come with rules, right? And those rules take many forms. For countries that are under a package, you got the Troika, but then also more generally for all states in the system, you get the European semester, the six-pack legislation, the Fiscal Compact Treaty, the two-pack. And just quickly, on the six-pack, which I suppose you all know something about that, these rules about budget surveillance, enforcement, toughening up the excessive deficit procedure. In the Budget Framework Directive, which is part of the six-pack, it does say member states need to provide information needed for accrual accounting by ESA standards, okay? And incidentally, and I don't know the current stage of these, I haven't followed, but I did note that in 2014, because that directive was to be implemented by 2013, in 2014, the Commission brought 17 infringement actions against 17 different member states for failure to implement the Budget Framework Directive, okay? So it's not happening yet. Okay, so anyway, and then the key thing, what I really want to talk to you about in the rest of my time, is that it wasn't just that they had rules, but they tried to go to courts. Now this, what do I mean? They said, well, what's going to be different this time, because we had rules before they were violated, we're going to judicialize the enforcement of these rules. So with the Fiscal Compact Treaty, they said every member state has to adopt balanced budget rules and a debt brake, and then as I show there, the rules have to take effect in national law through provisions of binding force, preferably constitutional, and guaranteed to be respected and fully adhered to. In other words, they were trying to judicialize balanced budget rules. Now, one irony in this is then, if you think about it, take a step back to that comparison I made with the US, you end up with the irony that in the EU, the center, right, the EU, imposes balanced budget rules and all this management on state fiscal policy in a very centralized way, whereas in the US, the federal government has zero control at all over any state budgets. Okay? So it's interesting. Okay, so can this judicialized approach save the euro? And I mean, my own work has been showing how in many policy fields, the EU really relies on a heavily judicialized approach to public policy. And here we see that they're extending this approach to fiscal policy. Can balanced budget rules work that they're imposing through the Fiscal Compact Treaty? And there's a literature on US on state balanced budget rules that says, well, yeah, they're good. They can encourage fiscal prudence, limit borrowing costs. And the literature says they work better the stricter their legal enforcement mechanisms are. And in some work I did with a student of mine, we started questioning this. We said, well, it's a little strange because these things are never enforced in court. There's been one case in 170 years, ever, right, in New Jersey, where I work, trying to enforce a state balanced budget rule. Only one. Now, the literature said, oh, yeah, but that's all right because they work, even though they're never enforced, by legal deterrence. They say governments are afraid to violate these rules because they could be dragged into court for violating their balanced budget rule. And what I've said, and this is where you're going to finally see a link with accounting, is I said, no, that's not really what's going on, because it's bond markets, not courts, that punish fiscal irresponsibility. But the problem is, of course, that sometimes bond markets, and we heard this in the last panel, sometimes bond markets, they react too late and then too forcefully, so they don't play that deterrent role in preventing states from building up excessive deficit. Instead, what it is they get in a panic and drive a state to insolvency, right? And so here's where balanced budget rules come in. What I say is that the way a balanced budget rule can work is that it creates a focal point for the bond markets to create a shared understanding of the point at which other investors will come in to punish the sovereign for its excessive or its irresponsible fiscal policy. And so that focal point is key because all the investors know that's the red line, and because the government knows that's the line I can't cross, right? Then they don't cross it. So that's how they can work to the extent they work. So what does that mean? Well, that means the implications, and here's where there's some link, that it's really clarity and transparency of the rule, not a focus on its legal enforceability or putting it in the Constitution, all that matters. The clearer the balanced budget rule, the more transparent information there is on the state of government accounts, et cetera, the greater will be its effectiveness. But if a balanced budget rule is very unclear, then increasing the strictness of its legal enforcement is not going to increase its effectiveness at all. Okay, so the emphasis on transparency we're talking about is key. Now, how about then the Fiscal Compact Treaty? Are the rules in there clear? Can they work? No. Okay. Basically, the Fiscal Compact Treaty, everyone talks about balanced budget rules. There's no balanced budget rule in the Fiscal Compact Treaty. They call for a structurally balanced budget over the 3-year business cycle, right? I mean, read this stuff. As defined in the revised Stability and Growth Pact with a lower limit of a structural deficit of 0.5% of, okay, you can go on and have a team of economists debating it, and then on top of it, then they say in exceptional circumstances, which has already been applied at least 3 times to Italy, France, and one other country, that this can be waived, okay? So, will the Fiscal Compact Treaty work? No, it won't work. And all this legal there's a quote from Daniel Gross in a paper last year. All this legal apparatus seems to have had little impact on actual fiscal policy making. And a nice quote from Professor David Cameron, not the Prime Minister, says the Fiscal Pact requires reliance on a statistic that cannot be observed. And that's, key to the problem. Now, if I got 30 seconds left, I won't finish everything I wanted to get to, but I just want to come back, to this idea of the incompleteness of the Euro design, just to say something more broadly. Because we've seen in many areas then, this incompleteness from the beginning, and what we've seen in the response to the crisis is again and again incomplete responses as well. So we're repeating this cycle of doing half-baked, minimal necessary measures to avoid an utter collapse tomorrow. And the last thing I want to leave you with, I'll just skip a couple of my slides, is I think this pattern, which I call failing forward, is unsustainable for the EU, because basically they're in this pattern of lowest common denominator, intergovernmental, worked out in a last-minute European Council meeting, produces incomplete structures, right, which then don't solve problems, create more spillovers that then perpetuate the second, the next round of crisis. But all the while, this is undermining public support for integration, creating the perception of an EU perpetually in crisis, and it can't go on. Thanks very much.
Please join me in thanking again our distinguished